I mentioned in my review for the Alfa Romeo 8C 2900 last week, of course another 20 million credit high roller, that these are prime examples of reviews where they really do matter, because with a normal car you can get the credits pretty easily, but for many players dropping 20 mil on a car is kind of a big deal, especially when it's a car with less than 200 horsepower, it's an old racer of some kind. Are you even going to use it that much? Is it any good? What can you do in terms of tuning? In terms of painting even, is it a good looking car, etc, etc. And I mentioned that I still had this one to talk about, the 1952 Mercedes 300 SL of the W194 shape. Now my personal expectations for this car, I will say, were fairly low. I'm not the biggest fan of the gullwing anyway. I know many people absolutely adore it and consider it to be maybe the first supercar ever, you could say. Some would say the Miura. This one, kind of. It was certainly very quick for its time and it's very, very valuable. The racing version I expected more so to be kind of like the Silver Arrows in a game like Toca Race Driver. You know, skinny little tyres, awful drum brakes, no downforce, and kind of like a boat to drive, a really powerful boat. This one actually not only exceeded those expectations, but this is actually a really good car to drive. Which is funny because if you just take it on a visual perspective, it almost looks like you asked someone to draw a 300 SL from memory. Like it's a little bit too squat, a little bit too wide, it's kind of round and soft looking, looks almost like a paper mache version of a 300 SL without any of the major details, just the overall silhouette. That, of course, is unsurprising for a race car. The fit and finish wasn't going to be the same, and I would imagine that rendering this car in a game could be more of a challenge than you'd think, because even though it doesn't have much to do visually, there's not much going on, to get the right kind of shape without it being too bloated, well, I would imagine that scanning the car really would help in the case of something like this. Otherwise you could easily end up with something that looks like PlayStation 1 graphics. In terms of its specs though, it compares quite interestingly to the Alfa that I talked about last week. Of course they're not really rivals to each other, but just for the sake of comparing it to something, the point level is a bit higher despite the fact that this is less powerful. Now of course, being a full-on race car, 178 horsepower isn't too much of a disadvantage. It's only one less than the Alfa Romeo, but it has a huge advantage on weight. It's over a couple of hundred kilos lighter, 1080 in fact, so just under about 1.1 metric tons, and the point level is higher than that Alfa Romeo, which was about 390. This is just under 435, so it's still pretty modest, but that's decent enough. One of the key questions, of course, that you'll be asking if you haven't dropped the 20 mil on this thing yet is what can you do with it? What is it like when you tune it, when you upgrade it? What kind of upgrades can it have? Something like the Alfa Romeo being supercharged could make a huge difference. Well, with this one you can't really do a huge amount to it, unfortunately. Or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. It certainly is not the kind of classic that you're going to be getting huge power out of. You can get it over 200, maybe in the higher 200 region, let's say, just to be generous, but it's certainly not going to break the bank when you do fully upgrade it. In terms of the settings, thankfully you can go pretty in depth with your diff, your suspension, your transmission, etc., and affect a lot of those things. Don't expect a lot in the way of downforce though. You know, Merc kind of has a reputation for flying cars. Thankfully it's not quite that bad in the game. In fact, quite the opposite. My expectations, as I said, were quite low. I expected it to be kind of an either ho-hum car or a straight-up bad one. Well, not only is it neither of those, it's actually really pleasant to drive. You can kick that tail out, but in a similar way to the Alfa Romeo, but better. You can use that slip and slide back end to steer it with the throttle, which is very authentic. You know, you would often see classic and vintage racers doing just that, so it's cool to see that mirrored quite accurately in the game. And it's really forgiving to drive, I think, not least of which is it helped by having only 180 horsepower. That's a nice level to be working with. It's not some crazy huge V12, as cool as that would be, but it's a much more modest take on a race car. And incidentally, the engine is naturally aspirated here, of course front mounted, rear wheel drive as you'd expect. Ultimately, I would say that this is a car which, if you are looking to actually use your high roller, you might actually get some pretty decent use out of this one, because it reminds me in some ways of something like the Alfa, in some ways kind of like the Alfa TZ2 as well as the 8C, in terms of being very lesser powered performance cars. And as I mentioned in the past, the problem with the Alfa TZ2 is it feels like it kind of falls into a bit of a no man's land. It's really nice to drive, but it's just so underpowered, especially if you compare it in the Gran Turismo 6 days to a lot of other high rollers. It kind of feels like it's got nowhere to belong. It's so expensive, but it's nowhere near quick enough to justify it, and yet this one, even though it's more expensive than the Alfa Romeo, it actually does feel quite useful. You could use this very effectively at, say, 400 to even 500 point events for classic or just unlimited class vehicles. The fact that you can use it in normal performance point events rather than, group whatever, means it is going to be way more useful than if they treated it purely as a race car, and that's always a nice advantage to have. And even if you just buy it as a collector's piece, well, it's not quite as photogenic as some others like the Alfa Romeo, but it's not a bad looking car for those who are Merc aficionados, and even for someone like me who's not a fan of the old Gullwing, this is still a really good car to drive. In fact, especially if someone like me who isn't really a fan, who isn't super into the 300SL, if someone like me does like it, that kind of highlights how good it must be. It's a really pleasant car to drive, and even though it's not going to rip your face off, it's not going to be tremendously quick or blow your mind in terms of what it can do, it's very nice to drive. The handling is really nicely weighted, nicely balanced, and honestly, when it comes to classic racing at least, especially in lower point levels, it really feels like you only need to do one thing to it, and that is just stretch the gears out, because it's really limited on that top speed for transmission settings, because you'll see later on in this event, it hits the limiter so quick, and the other classics even will catch up quite quickly. So if you do add the full-on race transmission, stretch those gears out just a little bit more, that really could make all the difference, because in a 1952 Mercedes racer with a similar kind of power output to something like a DC2 Integra, that's quite a good combo to have, certainly for lower point events, and certainly for those of us who like to not only win, but flex on everyone while you do, by doing it in a 20 million credit car. So I would say, as far as this one goes, it's actually a fantastic addition to the High Rollers Club. It's not the most powerful thing, it's not the quickest thing, but it's much better to drive than I thought it would be, and actually very, very enjoyable to use. So ultimately, that's it for my 2 cents on the 20 million credit Mercedes 300SL, and of course, if you've already bought it or have thoughts on it, drop them down below. Of course, check out the Alpha review, and I've done plenty of other High Rollers reviews here on the channel as well, and until next time, I'll see you then. But for now, thanks for watching.